You're listening to the Mind Over Finger podcast, episode number 78.
Welcome to the Mind Over Finger podcast, discussions on mindful music making, efficient practice, and building a purposeful career. And now your host, Dr. Renée-Paule Gauthier.
Hi everyone, I hope you're doing fantastically well today. In this episode, I share with you the conversation I had with Trevor Jones on his podcast, The Scholarship Roadmap. The Scholarship Roadmap is the young musician's GPS to their musical futures, and it's Trevor's mission to guide them in finding the school that is a perfect match for them to build a vibrant career in music without being saddled with debt. We cover a lot of ground in this 40-minute conversation, including the importance of finding the right teacher for you, developing an efficient practicing system and excellent awareness, why practicing slowly isn't enough, how to find comfort in your performance, how to reverse engineer your audition preparation, and finally, we dig into the relationship musicians have with constructive criticism. I had a great time speaking with Trevor, and I hope you find tons of value in our discussion. Let's go to the show.
People are told practice slowly. What does that mean? So some people just go in the practice room and they play stuff slowly. That doesn't mean they're learning anything. That definitely doesn't mean they're developing the right habits, because you can play slowly and poorly at the same time.
Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Scholarship Roadmap podcast. The Scholarship Roadmap is an online program for student musicians pursuing degrees and careers in music. I am Trevor Jones, the founder of the Scholarship Roadmap. I designed this program for student musicians, parents, and anyone seeking clarity in the college music school preparation process. This podcast features the voices of professional musicians, musician entrepreneurs, and student musicians. Our theme for episode 5 through 8 is, What Teacher Should I Study With in Music School? Today, my guest is Dr. Renée-Paule Gauthier. Renée is a violinist based in Chicago and performs with Lyric Opera, Joffrey Ballet, Elgin Symphony, and the Chicago Philharmonic. Renée is the string area coordinator, co-director of the chamber music program, and violin instructor at North Park University in Chicago. Renée hosts the Mind Over Finger podcast, currently in its 3rd season, and it focuses on mindful music making, efficient practice, and building a purposeful career. Renée is currently enrolling the 2nd round of her program, Music Mastery Experience. The 3-month experience, open to professionals, student musicians, and passionate amateurs, begins September 21st, and in it you'll discover how to implement mindful and effective practice techniques, make them habits, and get results. I really love this discussion with Renée. She digs into so many great ideas. If you are looking for a way to structure your practice sessions, a way to practice, and what to look for in a teacher and how they can help you with those topics, this is the conversation for you. Enjoy this conversation with Renée-Paule Gauthier. I want to start out discussing your musical training. So specifically, how did your musical training prepare you for your life's path, and both directly in music and then indirectly in non-musical activities?
Thanks for asking. And I could even say that I was extremely fortunate in my schooling and who I ended up studying with. And talking with colleagues, it's not the case for every musician. So when I look at what you're doing, and you and I have been talking about, your program and the work that you do and what you provide to students is so important, because I am one of the fortunate who has had wonderful experiences with teachers and ended up, going to the schools that were great for me. And I hear so many horror stories out there from colleagues, also from teachers or young professionals entering the world. And, I think that what you're providing is so necessary, so important, because without that guidance, it's not always obvious. And sometimes we have guidance by well-meaning people who are not always in tune, no pun intended, to what we need. So I think that having the information and the insight that you provide is so important. So I want to put that out there because I see it all the time, how difficult it can be to navigate these roads and find that. So anyway, to answer your question finally, I started studying the violin in a young age. And then at the age of 9, I started with a teacher who was so wonderful in always guiding me to listen better and explore. And he was such a huge music lover and extremely just a brilliant mind. And my mother would always practice with me. So for me, I would go and have these, amazing lessons with him, who is so enthusiastic and just kind of jumping up and down and yelling and so inspiring, and not yelling at me, but just being like so ecstatic about music in general and just be like, yeah, this is great. Do you hear this? And then I would go home and have 2-3 hour a day lessons with my mother, who was not a violinist. She was a pianist, but she was a musician, and she would take home, notes. Actually, she would carry, remember the big boom boxes? They were super big back then. She would take that to my lessons and record lessons and take notes. So that's kind of how my whole mindful practice was born without me knowing about it. And I realized when I went to college, then I was left to my own devices and started practicing on my own, that I would have two kinds of practice. I had the everyday practice, just, turning on the timer and being like clocking in time. And then I would have the kind of practice where it's like an hour before the lesson or an hour before the rehearsal or a week before the competition. And they were not the same. And that got me really curious more and more as the years went on. And as I became a professional, where you have to give out results like this day after day, and developed subsequently tools so that I could save time, then becoming a mother, even more time is necessary, and seeing my students struggle with this lack of awareness. Sometimes you don't have the methods on how to practice, and other times not only do you not have the practicing systems and methods, but you don't even know how to pay attention, how to listen, how to how to experience playing music and identify and assess what you're doing. So all of this put together got me to do some really serious introspection and research when I was doing my doctoral studies, and really kind of elaborate a system that has been very successful with my students and helping them develop this awareness, and some practicing tips and audition performance preparation. So yeah, it's been a journey that started very young, I would say.
One word that I see you speak about and write about all the time is intentional. So I would love to hear you speak about what you mean when you say intentional practice.
So I would bring it back to the word presence, and intentional as well, in terms of knowing what you're after, having a clear idea of what you want to hear, what you're trying to accomplish in the practice room. I think that so often people, for example, people are told practice slowly. What does that mean? So some people just go in the practice room and they play stuff slowly. That doesn't mean they're learning anything. That definitely doesn't mean they're developing the right habits, because you can play slowly and poorly at the same time. So what does it mean to be intentional? I think is really to pay attention, be curious, at the same time having some very clear goals as to what you're after. And then there's a whole other dimension of self-compassion, because sometimes it takes a long time to get where we want to be. So it's all of these things, but intentional, I think, would probably start with having an idea of where you want to be, but then also really pay attention. And I don't like the word scrutinize so much, but I would say maybe really observe keenly everything that you're experiencing, not just what you're hearing, but what you're seeing and what you're feeling. And that would be both emotionally and physically what you're feeling.
My students who are, say, in high school and preparing for college auditions, you sometimes see, the pressure is ratcheting up. Oh God, I have this audition, it's impending, or, I have 5 to 7 auditions and they're coming up, we're in early September now. And so they're coming up in January and February and March. And there's so much pressure because they're going to determine potentially what we're going to do with the next 4 years of our life. And let's say you're a student musician and you've just never really dug much deeper than, I just need to practice more. I just need to play my instrument every single day. I don't really have a goal. I'm just going to play every day. What are some kind of first steps that you would give to a student in this situation who's trying to make a deeper and more meaningful progress in their practicing?
Yes. So if I am to give you a mini music mastery experience here, I would say really start by finding a system to keep track of your progress. Because for some people, it's too vague and music making can be very abstract. So I would find a way to make it concrete that works for you. And in general, I'm a strong advocate of practice journals. I'm less so of those that are pre-guided. You know what I mean? I think that it's important for you to figure out, do you like to write long sentences, or are you someone who likes chart with numbers? Or do you actually prefer text for some repertoire technique or excerpts, or do you prefer charts for other? It could be a combination of both. So I would say finding the time to figure out, how do I like to keep track of my progress? Start incorporating recording a lot in your practice. So that's the first thing that they could do. I mean, first is get the music, put it in the binder. Don't just have flying photocopies going everywhere and losing half of them. That drives me crazy. So put in the binder, but then look at your timeline. How much time do you have? And if it's something that they've already started working on, I would say do a take today. Just record everything and assess where you are. And one thing I like to ask my coaching clients to do, and my students also, is record it and give yourself a grade on everything on your level of comfort. So not necessarily how you think it was on a scale from 1 to 10, but maybe how it felt on a scale from 1 to 10. And subsequently, listen to it and give yourself another grade to see how effective do you think that was? Or maybe based on how prepared do you want it to be, what does it sound like on the recording? And it's really interesting to see the two numbers comparing. If they're close, that's a good sign. And if they're not, that gives us so many clues as to where all the work should be focused a lot in the beginnings. And then I would say I'm a big fan of reverse engineering. So, right, when is the audition? Well, make sure that you give yourself some time to relax. If it's a college audition, you'll need to be traveling. So don't plan on the 3 days before the audition to be practicing, because you're going to be going somewhere and, trying to find a sandwich somewhere at 10 p.m. on the highway. And then schedule also mock auditions, lessons, all of that stuff ahead of time. And one other thing that you could do is set milestones as to, where in the process do you want to feel with all of your repertoire? Are you playing stuff by memory? Well, it'd be a great idea if it was all memorized 6 weeks ahead of time. That'd be something I would put in the calendar, for example, like all memorized by that date. And then there's just a multitude of practicing techniques. I really love of course I love it. I developed the practice model is what I use with my students. And basically, in the nutshell, what it is when you get to the deep practice part, where it's really a passage you're trying to learn or something you're really struggling with, is to go through the process of chunking, mapping, then learning it. And I really use ongoing memorization as the catalyst there to make everything learned at a deep level. So you would take these 5 lines that you're struggling with. I'm trying to think of a bass excerpt, but I don't have many coming to mind right now. I haven't sat through many bass auditions in my life. But, like if you take a 5-line passage, I don't think you should practice maybe all 5 lines at the same time. And you could just chunk it, take a small, I like to call it bite size, because that's something that you can take, chew it, then you're going to be able to swallow it. If it's too big, you're going to choke on it. So you need to choose something that is bite size, map it. What I mean by that is just notice what's happening in this passage. Some fingerings, bowings. What is it? Is it a scale? Is it a chord progression? Are there some patterns? Are there articulation? All these things. And then you put it through these drills there's a lot of techniques. We cover all of this in the Music Master Experience, like tons of slow work techniques and fast work techniques, and then performance techniques. And then you get it to a playing level. But then as you get closer to that performance date, you want to start incorporating a lot more performance practice, playing run-throughs, or not necessarily run-throughs of the whole piece, but maybe of sections more frequently throughout the practice, and really, really make performing part of your practice. I mean, an example I give is you could even put a timer that goes off every 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes, perform something for yourself. But you can't stop, or, it's a performance. And just put yourself in there. Simon Fisher, who's a violin pedagogue, a wonderful pedagogue, who wrote many wonderful technique books for violin, was a guest on the Mind Over Finger podcast. And he used that term that I'm going to use from now on, and he calls it spotlight performing. He says, wherever you are, whatever the time of day, it's like you turn on the spotlight and you just perform. Whether it's a measure or a whole movement, it's that little spotlight moment where you put yourself in this mindset of, I am now performing. So, I mean, that was a long answer to your question, but, and it just gives you a general idea, but those are a few things that I would do.
That is wonderful. I think if anybody listened to that answer, they could have an entire strategy for how to move forward towards their college auditions. I love the point that you brought up about how does it feel after you practice something, because even if you record something and let's say it sounds passable, it's not amazing, it's not terrible, it's somewhere in the middle, but you just felt very uncomfortable. Maybe you had a lot of tension in your left shoulder or your right hand. That ultimately isn't how you want to perform. You don't want to go to these college auditions or any audition and perform with a lot of tension. So that kind of having that goalpost of, is this comfortable, can really inform where you need to go next with your practice, what you need to check in on with your teacher. Hey, my right hand is just feeling very tense. Do you have any suggestions on what I can do? Also, because I'm practicing bite-sized pieces of music, it only happens in these 8 measures. That's where it's really getting in trouble. And by taking that sort of active approach in your practice, you and your teacher can get to the core of what the problem is much more quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does, it has a second, sorry, I'm having a French moment here. English is not my first language. So sometimes I start a sentence in French and I can't get out of it in English. The second benefit of paying attention to how you feel is that sometimes we don't feel good as we're performing something. And that starts to really play tricks on us because we don't feel good. We think it sounds terrible. And then we tense even more and we start to have this internal chatter that is so destructive, where it takes us away so much from how we perform because we're not feeling great. And sometimes that's why I was saying the numbers, if they compare is great. If they're similar, it gives you clues. If they're not, it also gives you clues, because sometimes you could perform an excerpt and feel like a 2, and then you listen to it and you're thinking, well, kind of sounds like a 5 or 6. So that's so funny. So despite me not feeling great, probably because I'm working too hard, I can still make it sound like pretty good. So if you're in the middle of a performance and you feel really, well, I shouldn't say bad, but let's say you don't feel as comfortable as you would like to, you can still find some comfort in thinking, you know what, this passage, I never feel great, but it still sounds good. So I can just not worry about it, just keep going, in a couple measures, feel better. So it had this added benefit of also quieting our mind when we realize that ultimately we would love to feel amazing at all times, but there are also ways that we could actually still perform at a really high level while momentarily not feeling amazing. The opposite is also true. So if you feel amazing as it doesn't sound great, well, chances are you're not listening hard enough.
Very, very true. So this entire approach to practicing, I find just having an approach to practicing is something that you just see so many people, and not just students, professionals, passionate amateurs, whoever, they don't really have a way that they practice. It's, well, I start out with long tones, I play scales, arpeggios, I play excerpts, and then I play some solo stuff, and I've kind of hit everything. But that's a structure of repertoire that you're going to practice, but it's not necessarily a method. So I wonder, I feel like one of the most important components when a student is looking for a teacher at the collegiate level is that they need to look for someone that really helps them develop a method of practicing. So I imagine you agree with that, but I wonder if there are any other qualities that you think are just absolutely crucial that somebody looks for in a college instructor.
Yes. And that's such a tricky question, because everyone will have different opinions on how a teacher makes them feel. And that's why, I remember being at Eastman, and people would transfer out of my studio. And I know why, because I love my Eastman teacher, Mr. Zeitlin, but he was old school hard, and he was yelling at me. But at that time, I sort of had the insight that, you know what, I have a lot to learn from him. And that's just his style. And if I can, live with it, I'll learn a lot. But it was not as great for some other students. So it depends so much of where you are, also what you respond to. I would say sample lessons definitely help with this. And think about it. I mean, our teachers, they give us so many amazing notions, but even if you walk out of the lesson with one golden nugget already there, that's worth the whole lesson. Even just one amazing concept that you could ponder on for hours or weeks or years. I think we've all had these moments where you graduate and then 5 years later, you're like, oh, I get it. Like what he said, I finally get it. It took me 5 years. I get it. So I think that we really have to both, I want to make sure I say this in the right way. We have to pay attention to our intuition, yet at the same time look at ourselves very objectively and say, I really want to feel great about this teacher, but he says things I don't like, and I don't feel good about that. So do you not feel good about that because it doesn't match how you learn at all, and you can see a problem long term? Or maybe you're not open to constructive criticism. So what's tricky, though, is that we know there are some teachers out there who, pass the line, and the constructive criticism becomes destructive criticism, and that's not what you want. But I've also seen some students who are just really not open-minded to the instruction that's being offered. So there's a little bit of both. A big concept in the deep practice model is this beginner's mind. And it's this idea that sometimes when we feel like we're an expert, we're closed-minded to ideas. And we need to keep this enthusiasm that the beginners have. They want to know everything and they're open to soak up all of the information. So we need to keep that in mind as well, that sometimes a teacher is going to ask us to explore an avenue that we're not familiar with. And it could be a source of great insight, knowledge, inspiration. So are we open to these things? So, but other times there's a voice inside of us that tells us it could be the opposite, right? This teacher is famous. Everybody loves him, he's or her, and all her students are amazing. They all get jobs. But you just walk away from lessons with this person feeling so sad and depleted, despite trying your best to be open-minded. So there's a little bit of both. So we need to make sure I'm repeating myself, but I feel like it's so important that there's part listening to intuition, so hard, just paying attention to what the little voice inside says, at the same time, keeping yourself in check and saying, well, am I being too easy on myself, or am I just sad when I hear criticism? And am I open-minded to what this person could teach me? So I don't have a perfect answer for you. I don't know if there is a checklist that one, maybe you provide that. I don't know. It's not easy.
No, I think that is such a great way of summing it up, because there always is that little voice. I remember it so well when I took trial lessons with my principal instructors. And, when you walk away with that nugget, or in my case, I felt like I walked away with, 15 or 20 nuggets after a 1-hour lesson. I thought, I have to study with this person for 4 years. There's no way I can. But I think it's also such a great point of going in and being open. And let's say if you have a little bit of a visceral reaction to something that an instructor says, it's really important to understand where that's coming from. And did the instructor say it, give the feedback in a way that was unkind? Because obviously being unkind is not something I think anyone seeks in lessons, but there's a difference between being unkind and just saying something very honestly. Also, if you're having trouble taking constructive criticism, that's not going to bode well for post-college either. So this kind of transitions to the other side of the coin then. When people audition for you, mm-hmm. and you are considering them for your studio, what qualities are you looking for in students?
Funny enough, the first one would be, are they teachable? Are they open-minded to what I have to say? How do they respond? And not so much in terms of can they execute right away, but can I see that they're trying? And you teach too, so you know what I'm talking about. When we see when they're trying, whether or not there's an immediate result, we see that the person is really thinking about it and they're trying and they're responding to what you're teaching. They're paying attention. So that's definitely, I would say, one of the first one that I look into. And, it's so different from person to person. A level of enthusiasm for what they're doing is something I love to see in a student. How open-minded are they to what I can teach? And how will they apply themselves in trying to execute it?
If they're not open to the teacher's input, what's the point?
Yes.
Like, what are we even doing here?
And sorry to interrupt, because I remember one time someone was actually that's a good example. They were taking a sample lesson from me, and I explained something, and they were not really successful in achieving it. And then at some point, I was trying to figure out if I should move on to something else. And she looked at me and she was like, I really want to understand this. Can you repeat it again? And I was like, oh, yes, I'm so happy you're asking this question and you're voicing out that you don't quite understand. Because keep in mind, I don't know her yet. I don't know how she learns yet. So maybe she's extremely visual or she needs to see it and hear it several times, or she needs it to be explained very in detail. So the more you help your teacher guide you in your learning experience by talking in your lessons, asking questions when you don't understand, that's something that you need to voice out so that the teacher can then adapt their teaching to respond to what your needs are. Because we do our best, and sometimes you feel like you've expressed a concept very clearly, but if you've been very specific with the details and you're talking to a visual learner and you haven't quite demonstrated it enough, when they say it, can you show me? Then you're so happy to do it. I love when a student tells me what they need and they ask questions. So this was one of my favorite moments when she asked that, because I was like, yes, okay, let's figure this out. And then I tried to explain a bunch of different ways, and she started getting it, and it was such a beautiful moment. So I would say that also, like, voice out what you need to your teacher.
I love that so much. And I've been in that situation as well. And I'm curious, you performed as a concert master. That concept, like, imagine a conductor is, looking at you and saying, Renee, we need this phrase to be like this. And if you respond in a way that is feigning that you understand, then you play it in a way that the conductor does not want. That's a big problem. I imagine you've been in the position maybe where a conductor said something to you and you don't know exactly what they're looking for. Has that come up?
Oh, yes, it happens. Yes. And sometimes it's caused because you are maybe, well, sometimes in my case too, I mean, not so much anymore, but now that my English is good, sometimes you just literally do not understand the words. That doesn't happen so much anymore. But sometimes they don't want to spend too much time there because there's a whole orchestra. So they explain it very quickly. Maybe you're distracted by someone talking behind, you know what I mean? And I think, like, it's the same kind of thing. Then what's important to do is go talk to the conductor at the break and be like, I don't think I got that very quickly, because if it's exactly what you say. If they ask for something and you pretend you're going to do it and then do it, it kills the magic. It makes it no fun for anybody.
I play lots of musical theater. And when you sub for someone, for instance, and you have a massive amount of music, you're trying to play it the way they play it, because that's your job. And if they explain something to you and it's not clear and you just keep nodding your head, and then you don't play it the way it's supposed to be played, that's a huge problem. So this skill that Renee dug into of being able to communicate with your teacher if you don't understand something, and then working in tandem with the teacher to make sure that they are explaining it in a way or demonstrating it in a way that makes sense to you, that will lead to a much deeper relationship with your teacher that will ultimately serve you the best.
I mean, I have an example of that. If you give me 30 seconds, and I go back to Mr. Zeitlin because I love this man so much. And see, it illustrates where his teaching style might have not fit some people, but there's, legions of us who just adore him. And this was a few months after I started studying with him. And, this was a lesson where I think he might have yelled particularly loud that day or something. And my thing, though, is I never wanted to cry in the lessons. I might have cried a few times after, but, I was kind of defeated, but I don't like leaving defeated without saying something. So I told him, I said, Mr. Zeitlin, I just feel like my playing keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I didn't want to say you're yelling more today. And then I just saw, like, the humanity in this man just kind of awaken. And he came, he walked towards me, put his hand on and patted me on the shoulder with, like, this kindness and this love in his ears, in his eyes, so not his ears. And he was looking at me as though he was just about to tell me a great secret. And he did, because he looked at me and he said, no, you're not getting worse and worse. You're hearing better and better. And in that moment, it reframed all of his yelling to feel like he's angry at me, to he sees something that could come out and it's not coming out and he wants it to come out. And I understood in that moment. I mean, just talking about it now, I get emotional again. But the look in his eyes when he was telling me this, because he was so excited to share that with me, like, you're hearing better and better. And I think that I'm so happy that I spoke up at the end of that lesson, because I was just going to walk out defeated. But I decided to share it with him. And then it turned out to be a moment where I really understood something very powerful, is that sometimes we feel like we're in the middle of a setback. And that goes back to also beginner's mind too, because sometimes when you're trying to change something in your playing, you have to surrender a little bit, and you feel as though your playing is not as good. But what's actually happening is that you're strengthening a skill, but because it's unfamiliar, it's perceived as your skill as diminished when you're actually strengthening it, and then it will soar eventually. But there are times when you feel defeated because you're starting to understand or hear or see new things, and that may appear as a setback, and then you realize, no, it's not. Like, this is what happens when massive progress is about to happen. So anyway, I just love this story for what it taught me, but also the fact that, like, teachers are human. And sometimes when you really try to connect with them at the human level, you find these treasures of wisdom inside. And, yeah, so for me, I mean, I just love the men. What can you do? And, but when you have a hard time creating this connection with the teacher, of course, that can be a telltale sign as well.
First of all, that is an incredibly beautiful story. I think what can be so challenging about that is, are we going to get there in a single lesson, in a single trial lesson? So in some ways, when you're looking for instructors, there is a little bit of a leap of faith. And, you know, what we were talking about, I mean, yeah, you can look at the results of the studio and what other students are saying and everything. But if you do get that trial lesson, how do you feel in that moment? What's that little voice saying? Having a story like that in the trial lesson, probably the odds of that happening are pretty low, because there's been so much trust built over lesson after lesson. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see in auditions? And this not just in auditions for your studio, but any auditions that you're sitting on as part of the audition committee.
First of all, I think for the students to feel like the people in the panel are listening with, I don't know if there's an expression in English for this, but we're, yes, critical because we're trying to assess, but we want you to do so well. So there's no one sitting there with, in French we have an expression that, you know, no one's sitting there with a brick waiting to throw it at you. This is not what's happening. So for people to walk in the audition room knowing that people sitting behind this table, they're rooting for you. And sometimes you get distracted because you see the panel, they're writing things down, they're not making eye contact with you. Never take that personally, because they're seeing a lot of people that day. They're probably running behind in their notes, so they're trying to write as quickly as they can. They're pulling your resume out, trying to figure out who you are. So always know that regardless of the appearances, if the committee looks busy, if they're looking at you, not looking at you, whatever is going on, they're always on your side. The second thing is to play in, instead of focusing on what you're doing in the moment, is asking yourself what they want to hear. And then as you play, you start to second guess yourself because you're not sure that what you do is pleasing for them. I would say just trust your own work and show them who you are. And yes, play in tune, in time, and in tone when need that, but also play as beautifully as you can with as much conviction as you can. And do not try to guess what you think they want to hear. So these two things together, I think, really help for a performance that's more enjoyable for the performer, and also for the people sitting behind the table. And I would say just walk in with a big smile, make eye contact, just, feel happy to be there. It's a beautiful moment.
I love that so much. The trust your own work and show them who you are. I think One thing that I coach my students and clients to do is choosing repertoire that obviously needs to satisfy the requirements that are being asked by the teacher, the studio, the school. But they also need to show the best parts of you as an artist and your musicianship. And so when we get into this mindset of guessing, well, I wonder what Dr. Gauthier wants to hear me play in this audition. Let's not start there. Dr. Renée-Paule Gauthier, thank you so much for being here today. And be sure to listen to Renee's podcast, the Mind Over Finger podcast, and check out her second round of Music Mastery Experience, which is currently enrolling and beginning on September 21st. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like more of this content, visit thescholarship.roadmap.com. Connect with me on Instagram and Facebook at The Scholarship Roadmap. Subscribe to this podcast and get in touch with me at trevor@thescholarship.roadmap.com. And if you'd like to discuss your musical future, book a call, no charge, no commitment. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this chat with Trevor Jones from the Scholarship Roadmap. If you relate to this conversation, get in touch with us and let's keep this discussion going. I am Mind Over Finger on both Instagram and Facebook, and he's the Scholarship Roadmap. And if you're a young musician thinking about a career in music, I strongly encourage you to check out the Scholarship Roadmap program at scholarshiproadmap.com. Trevor has years of experience working with young musicians and helping them find the perfect school match for them, and he can help you find yours. The program will assess your needs, align them with the right school and teacher, and focus your attention on the fundamentals of the music school preparation process. Trevor will provide you with all the tools and resources that will bring clarity to your school search and empower you to make decisions that will best serve you. So check out the Scholarship Roadmap. As always, I'll have all the information related to this episode in the show notes. You can find them via your podcast app or by visiting mindoverfinger.com, where you can also find more information about mindful, efficient practice and performance preparation. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter and receive your free guide to a super productive mindful practice using the metronome. Finally, I hope to see you in the Mind Over Finger tribe. That's my private Facebook group where I pop in once a week to talk about mindful practice and answer your questions. It's a great community, and you can find it at facebook.com/groups/mindoverfingertribe. So that's it for today. Again, thank you, and à bientôt.